I'm back on the River Ribble in Preston. We fished back in January and caught some wonderful dace on the waggler. Today I'm fishing for these roach on the stick float. I've been fishing for about an hour and I've caught some absolutely beautiful roach, some of them over a pound. The swim we've selected here is called the Church Deeps, and it's about 20 pegs further down than where we fished for the dace last time. And you can see the river's quite a bit wider here, and to go with that fact, it's also quite a bit deeper. The river here is between 4 and 6 foot deep, and I think that's why it's a preferred area for the roach. Another great feature about this peg is you can see that I'm on the inside of a bend, so the flow's coming and pushing over towards the far bank, and I understand it's deeper over there, and the fact that I'm on the inside of a bend creates a bit of a slack. And you can understand what that's achieving here, because this is almost like a sand beach. So all this sand has been deposited over the years. Anyway, it's a fantastic roach peg, as I've already found, and I'm going to get stuck back into them. The rigs I've set up today are all stick floats, so they're top and bottom floats. And the main advantage of using a top and bottom float over a waggler, particularly when I'm fishing for roach like this, is I can control and present the bait so much better in the deeper water. So as you can see, I'm not fishing very far out. I'm probably only fishing about a rod and a half out. And I've got these beautiful roach feeding quite confidently now. Obviously a limitation of a stick float can be the distance that you're fishing out. I am feeding another line about a third out, and I've set up a couple of longer rods with some heavier stick floats to try as the session progresses. It's good to try and feed a couple of lines because I can switch between the two, so I'm not pounding one line too much. And it does give me another option if the fish back off. Maybe if the sun comes up or there's a lot of disturbance on the bank, the fish might drop out further, and by feeding that line it gives me another option. Anyway, I'm catching really well on this close in line now, and I've been feeding casters with a bit of hemp, and the best hook bait is actually double caster, so the fish are feeding really confidently. So let's take a look at the stick floats that I'm using today. And it's quite interesting really, because there is a wide variety of different floats to use. On my inside line, because I'm not having to cast very far, I don't need to use a float with a lot of weight. So I've actually set two floats up. I've set one for number 4, standard stick like that, which has got a nice dome top. It's not too thick. And I love these floats because they really present the bait nicely on the drop. I've got examples like that Drennan plastic one, or this old style cane stick float. So I really like those when I'm fishing close in and I want to present the bait on the drop. Another float that I've set up for fishing close in is this wire stem Dave Harrell 6 number 4. Now I've set two floats up because this one gives me another presentation. It means I can fish a bit over depth, and because of the shoulder here I can hold the float back, and that means I can really edge the float through. I mean, this peg's it's not flowing fast today, but I've got a bit of a downstream wind, and this wire stem provides a bit of weight, which means I can hold the float back and present the caster or whatever bait I'm using very nicely. Just gives me another option. Then finally, when I'm fishing further out, I need to consider adding some weight to the float and also be able to see it. So I'd like to switch between big wire stem versions like this Woody or this Dave Harrell. The Woody's got a slightly more slender tip and a bit of a shoulder to help hold back, whereas this Dave Harrell one's got a bigger dome. So if I've got bad light conditions or if I'm casting a long way out, I can see that better. And finally, I've got a couple of lignum sticks as well, which I'll switch to if I'm struggling to get the distance, because I've got extra weight in the base of the stick float, which means I can achieve greater distance and also much better control of the float as I'm trotting the float down the river. Well, look at that, that's an absolutely beautiful roach. It's got to be approaching a pound. I caught that on my over depth rig, and the shotting pattern is still strung out, but I'm fishing about a foot over depth and I'm just holding it back and easing the float through. Okay, so let's have a look at in a bit more detail of the actual shotting patterns that we're employing on the different rigs. This is the 6 number 4 Dave Harrell wire stem stick that I'm catching really well on. And as you can see, I've got the shot spaced out, probably only over about 3 foot there. So what I've got is I've got about a foot from my hook to the first dropper shot. And as I mentioned, I'm actually fishing this around about a foot over depth. So I'm laying the rig in and I'm just inching it through with the flow. And the bottom part of the shotting pattern is a couple of number 10s, then progressing up to number 8s. And you'll see that I've got them spaced quite close together. And then I suppose up to about where they're half the depth, I've got some number 8s together. So I've got 3 number 8s, 2 number 8s, 2 number 8s, and then 1 number 8. And what that does is it just gives me that control to ease the float through. So it's not really a strung out shotting pattern, it's kind of a compromise between bulked and strung out. But that's certainly been a very effective rig today. You'll notice that on all my rigs, I'm only using number 8 and number 10 lead shot. Obviously in the UK we can't use lead number 6s, so I'd rather use lead number 8s and double them up to achieve the same as a number 6. So this is my lighter strung out rig, and this is, I suppose, the classic kind of shirt button style rig. So again, I've got maybe not a foot, but I suppose it is getting on for a foot hook length, and then I've got the shot spaced very close together and almost equidistant apart all the way up to the float. So that gives me that lovely slow fall of the bait through the water, and it's a rig that I can work really well. So I'm not going to fish that much over depth, I'm going to fish that probably just over depth or just off the bottom, and I'm going to let that run through, and by holding back and letting it go, I can get the bait lifting up and then dropping back down in the water, just like the bait that I'm loose feeding. So I find that a great method when the fishing's perhaps a bit harder. And then finally on my big stick, I've got a similar kind of setup to the stick that I'm fishing closer in, whereas I've got shot close together and then progressively getting heavier. So I've got number 10s, 2 or 3 number 10s, then I've got 2 or 3 number 8s spaced out, then I've got 2 number 8s, 2 number 8s, 3 number 8s, 4 number 8s, 5 number 8s and 6 number 8s. And again, that's a fantastic rig to help me control the float, and that's really important when you're fishing further out. So when you're fishing past the rod end, that extra weight and that shotting pattern will give me a great rig that's very versatile. And you can see that I'm using a heavier float, so that's a 12 number 4 Dave Harrell. It's wire stem, so I've got some weight in the float and I can control it really easily. One final thing to think about when you're stick float fishing, which is a bit difficult, is what size of float to use on the day. The first thing to think about is the depth, and a good guide is 1 number 4 for every foot of depth. So if it's 4 foot deep, 4 number 4, 10 foot deep, 10 number 4. Obviously that's a rough guide, but it's a good one. And where you change is perhaps if it's windier like today and you need a bit more weight down the line to get the rig out and present it correctly. And also when you are fishing further out, obviously you need more weight in the float and you need therefore more shot down the line. So it's just all about adjusting and balancing the shot to the correct weight of float to present the bait perfectly. A quick top tip is, as you can see, I've got 4 rods set up here. I'm actually using 3 today. I have my ready rod sleeve, so I can have my rods ready before I get here. And also I think it's really key to have a number of rigs set up on winders, so you can change your rig quickly like you would do when you're pole fishing. And also if you do get a tangle, it saves you time, particularly if you're match fishing, because obviously if you're using 10 to 20 number 8s, it takes some time to put them on the line and rig them up correctly. So it's always a good idea to have some rigs set up. Well, as you can see, the wind's got up, and it's probably the worst kind of wind for when you stick float fishing, because it's a downstream wind. So it can make float presentation really difficult. So a couple of things to think about. You'll notice when I cast, I'm actually casting the float downstream, and then I can get the line behind it much easier. So to help that situation, I'm actually feeding slightly downstream as well. Obviously if I fed in front of myself and fished in front, it'd be very hard to control the float with this downstream wind. Another great thing to think about is having in your armoury a longer rod. This is a 15-foot rod, which really helps when you are fishing further out and when you're fishing in tough conditions like this. It means that that extra length will help you to get the line behind the float. If the wind's really bad and presentation suffering because the line keeps getting blown past the float, pulling it out unnaturally along the swim, what I'll actually do then is add some back shot. So I'll actually put a couple of number 8s above the float, and that will help to both sink the line behind the float to get it out the way of the wind, but it also helps to give you a bit of weight to hold back to as well. So back shotting can work really well in a downstream wind like this. Well, I've just bumped a couple of fish, so I'm going to change my hook length and put a new hook on. The hook length I'm using is Mac XT 010. If the fishing was a bit harder and I'm roach fishing, I don't mind dropping down to 08, because on hard days that can definitely get you more bites, but this 010 is working really well today. And I'm switching between an 18 and a 16 B560. So I'll just quickly tie one on, and then I think we'll talk about feeding. As with any kind of fishing, feeding is so important. And the way I've approached this swim today is I've fed hempen casters on the inside line. So I've been feeding a good amount of hemp, perhaps every 20 or 30 minutes. If the swim's gone a bit quiet, I've put 3 or 4 good handfuls of hemp in on that line. And I've been feeding every cast with 10 to 20 casters. And I've been varying the casters depending on how the fish are responding. It's been quite interesting because I've been also feeding a general area. When you start fishing, you're not really sure where the fish are going to be, but as the session progresses, you start to learn more. And what I've found is the bigger roach have actually been closer in. So every so often I've been putting a good handful of casters closer in, leaving that line and having a sneaky look every 20 minutes or so, and been catching some nice roach. I think maybe they get some confidence feeding on those casters on the bottom, but if I was to keep plundering that line, they'd move away. One quick tip I'm going to give you, which I really do with most of my hooks when I'm river fishing, is I like to squeeze the barb with some style pincers. So the micro barb on a B560 is not a big barb, but when I'm roach fishing, I like to just squeeze that barb. I think it achieves two things. One, it doesn't damage the bait in any way when I'm hooking the bait. And two, I think you bump less fish. If I was catching more dace, then I'd keep the barb as it was, because dace are so notorious for pulling out because of the way they twist and turn as they're fighting. But roach, I think it definitely pays to fish with a barbless hook or a hook which has had the barb pinched down. And there you go, that's a single caster on the 18, and I'm burying the caster I'm burying the hook inside the caster to get the best presentation. On the further out line, I'm feeding maggots, just to give me another option, a different bait. You know, on a day maybe caster might not work as well, so I'm giving myself an option of a different bait, and I'm feeding that differently. I'm not feeding it every cast, I'm feeding it perhaps every 3 or 4 casts, and I'm giving it a good 1 or 2 big pouchfuls of maggots. So my thinking there is, obviously I'm concentrating on the inside line, but I can keep another line being fed and hopefully concentrate some fish on that line as well, so I can switch between the two. Obviously as the day progresses, you know, you might find it gets harder, so you have to cut back on the feed, or you know, it might be a really good day when you can feed more bait. But I think it's interesting to think about the frequency that you're feeding and also the volume of bait. Today the further out line has produced far more dace than roach, but it's been great to switch between the two lines and rest the inside. I think if I just plundered one line today, it'd probably get a bit harder and bites might even dry up. But even when I'm feeding further out, I'm not forgetting to feed the inside line. Well, I caught that roach on my heavier stick float rig, and I backshotted it and I was fishing it and easing it through just a little bit further out. It's an absolutely beautiful roach. Well, I've been fishing for about 4.5 hours now, and I've had an absolutely fantastic day. The best line's been the close in line, just on the crease between the slack and the main flow. That's where I've caught the most roach, and I've caught more days fishing further out towards the middle of the river on maggots. But I've got to say, it's been one of the best days roach fishing I've had for a long time. Well, that's another cracking roach, over a pound. And with that, I'm going to call it a day. I've had an absolutely fantastic session here on the River Ribble. I've had over 30 pound of prime roach and dace. If you haven't tried stick float and caster, I'd urge you to give it a go. Have a look at the other video on YouTube on stick float fishing on the River Trent, and also drop me an email if you've got any questions. Thanks for watching.